Okay, we just discussed the Ozawa case, and in that case, Ozawa basically appealed to common sense, common knowledge of what defines race, namely skin color, of course, but also assimilation. And he had those two covered, he felt, because his skin was literally white, perhaps even whiter than some Caucasians. The Supreme Court denied Ozawa, and they appealed to science in denying Izawa. Okay, so science overrode common knowledge, and they basically said that, well, no matter what, you are Mongolian according to the science of race. You are not Caucasian, and therefore you're denied your claim to citizenship. Okay, so just a few months after Ozawa lost his case, along comes another Asian American. His name was Bhagat Thind, and here's a picture of Bhagat Thind. He actually served in World War I for the U.S. Army. Okay, so he's a veteran, and again, he considered himself assimilated. All right, and he must have felt emboldened by the fact that the Supreme Court appealed to the signs of race with the Zawa case. Why? Because at that time there was a prevalent and influential scientific theory of race that based the term Caucasian and Caucasians, right? The conception of Caucasians based on something called Indo-European language theory. Okay, now this is quite complicated, but here's the gist of Indo-European languages and their migrations throughout this part of the world. Okay, it was felt that originally the Indo-European language originated in what we call Ukraine today. In fact, the Caucasus mountain range is around here, and that's where you get the term Caucasian, right? It was felt that, people along the Caucasus range were, white, of course, but many anthropologists felt they were the most beautiful races in the world. Okay, the people were the most beautiful race. Nonetheless, what happens with the Indo-Europeans, and this happens a very long time ago, in the times of antiquity, right? What happens is they migrate, according to these scientists, to other parts of the world surrounding them. They even go to Central Asia, but they also go west, even the tip of England here, towards what we call Germany today, certainly to Italy. And with them, you see these linguistic commonalities, right? You could trace the linguistic families here to one primary linguistic group, the Indo-European, right, which originated in, again, this pink area called Ukraine today. Now, notice this. According to the theory, the migration of the Indo-Europeans also found themselves in northern India. Okay, so northern Indians were Aryans, to use the term, okay? Aryans, and that's synonymous with Caucasian in this Indo-European theory. Okay, by the way, you're familiar with Aryan as connected to, of course, the Nazi regime, right? Where do you think they got that term Aryan from, right? They got it from the Indo-European language theory, right? That a school of scientific thought about the race. And, of course, they believed that the most perfect races were in this area, Caucasians, right? Oh, also, the swastika. Okay, the swastika has its origins here, right, in India. It was a Hindu and a Buddhist religious symbol, okay? But the Nazi regime appropriated it, or perhaps misappropriated, right, to symbolize the racial superiority of Germans, right, or Aryans, to use a more accurate term as applied to the Nazi regime. Okay, so interesting to note there that, since race was central to Hitler and the Nazis, right, it doesn't surprise us that they, delve into the symbolic realm of, race, like using signifiers like Aryan and using symbols like the swastika. Anyway, uh, here is Bhagat Thind, and he originated from Punjab. Okay, where's Punjab? Northern India. Okay, so he is Punjabi. And according to Indo European language theory, therefore, he is Caucasian. Let's remember that the Ozawa case appealed to science, appealed to the scientific definition of Caucasian in denying Ozawa. So here is Thind, and again, he's also a veteran and assimilated. He presses his claim for citizenship. And again, he must have felt confident because just a few months earlier, the court appealed to science. He was appealing to science, okay? Bhagat Thind was appealing to science in his claim for citizenship. So what happens here? Well, the Supreme Court, led by the same justice, right, George Sutherland, denied Ozawa. And what was the source of knowledge for their denial? Well, it was common knowledge, okay? Common sense, right? Basically, they're saying that, sure, it may be true that he is Caucasian according to this language theory, but common sense tells us that he's not white, right? Look at this quote here from George Sutherland in the opinion. Quote unquote, Caucasian is at best a conventional term, okay? Underscore conventional, meaning popular, right? He's appealing to popular knowledge again. A conventional term with an altogether fortuitous origin, which under scientific manipulation has come to include far more than the unscientific mind suspects. So he claims that the whole term Caucasian was manipulated by science, whereas before he felt Caucasian, well, science was reinforcing, right, the definition of, Caucasian equals white, right? Okay, by the way, here's another quote from George Sutherland. Quote, it may be true that the blonde Scandinavian and the brown Hindu may have a common ancestor in the dim reaches of antiquity, but the average man, and again, bold that, right? The average man knows perfectly well that there are unmistakable and profound differences between them today. So this statement is affirming that scientific link, right, between Europeans and South Asians, but at the same time, it's insisting on their separation in the white racial imagination. Right, so should be apparent to you what's happening here. The Ozawa case, Ozawa appeals to common sense, a literal definition of white skin. He's denied by the Supreme Court on the basis of science. 3 months later, he comes Thind and appeals to science, feeling confident that he'll win because of the earlier Ozawa case. No, the Supreme Court appeals to common sense, right? Basically, arguing that Caucasian is at best a, quote, conventional term. Okay, so there seems to be an agenda here, right? A political agenda. In other words, it's to use our term, a racial project here, right? And I just mentioned the 1920s is the high point of nativism. So you could imagine what the agenda here. The agenda of the Supreme Court, as demonstrated in the Ozawa and Thind cases, is to protect the definition of the racial definition of the country as white, right? And to do this, you need to deny those who are not white inclusion. You have to exclude them. All right. And again, doesn't surprise us during the high point of nativism. Okay, so let's jump forward to the 1950s and the Cold War years in our discussion of racialized citizenship. It was obviously the case that with the Zawa and Thin case, well, obviously race figured prominently there, figured centrally, and it shows how citizenship is indeed racialized, even by the highest court of the land at that time. So it may lead you to ask, well, when were Asians finally given the right to naturalize? Okay, sure, we know the Asians born on U.S. soil are conferred citizenship with the Wong Kim-ark case, but what about immigrants? When will they be extended the right to pursue naturalization and ultimately gain citizenship? Well, this brings us to the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952. But first, it's important to discuss the historical backdrop that led to the passage of this act. These are the Cold War years, right? And, well, there was this struggle between the First World, that's to say, the U.S. and its allies, against the Second World, the USSR, the Soviet Union, and its allies, to attract the various nations that were newly decolonized, and that's the Third World. Now, in the struggle to win the allegiance of these various third world countries, the USSR, the Second World, was using very effective propaganda to attract these third world nations by calling out the United States, the so-called free world, right, as being racist. And to be specific, the U.S. Were treating their racial minorities as second-class citizens, right? There was such a thing as Jim Crow at the time, of course, racist immigration laws. So the Soviet Union basically said this: how can you expect the First World to treat you as equals when, in fact, look how they treat their persons of color in their own country? The U.S. could offer no counter-argument because it was indeed true. So, in this war of propaganda, right, between both the First and Second World, there was this increasing call to repeal race-based immigration laws because they felt it was necessary in that Cold War context. So the McCarran-Walter Act was passed in 1952. Now, this is a mixed bag, if you will, mixed effort for Asians. The negative side first. Well, it still enforced a quota of 2% total immigration number upon Asian countries. Okay, that means that in any given year, only 2% could come from Asian countries, right? Moreover, they still did not repeal the national origins quota. Okay, that will actually happen with the 1965 Act. But the positive aspects is that it finally repealed aliens ineligible for citizenship. And moreover, it ended Japanese immigration exclusion. All right. We already know that Chinese exclusion was ended with the Magnuson Act in 1943, if you recall. But with the Japanese and the Gentleman's Agreement, right, that finally was overturned with the McCarran-Walter Act. So look at that. Now you could have, let's say, the Issei, right? Issei Japanese, the immigrants now could pursue naturalization and become an American citizen, just like their American-born children, the Nisei. All right. So from this point forward, you don't see that racial barrier for naturalization in U.S. laws.